If you've been following the Canadian sporting news, you've probably heard about the upcoming CFL rule changes. In an attempt to create new fan interest and make the game more entertaining, the CFL is going to make some major changes. The most notable include sticking the goalpost to the back of the end zone, something that has been a feature of football in the United States for decades now. And shockingly, the changes also include shortening the field to 100 yards. So there are concerns that the things that make the Canadian game special are slowly drifting away. But to explain this, we really have to go back in time and look at just why Canadian football is different than United States football to begin with. Okay, back in the beginning there was just rugby. If you went back to 1874 to watch the famous McGill-Harvard games, you would notice that they played rugby. And of course, there was a lot of variation in the rules of rugby back in those days. Now, as you should know, it was Walter Camp who revised the rules of football in the 1880s in the United States. In contrast, the Canadian game first evolved away from the old rugby style in 1903 with the famous Burnside rules. However, not every football organization in Canada agreed with the Burnside rules, which borrowed heavily from the college game in the United States. In particular, the rules around the 3-down system and the requirement to get 5 yards for a first down were extremely controversial. The hard thing to understand about football in those days is that there really was not a strong organization that dictated the rules in either Canada or the United States. In fact, it wasn't really until 1906 that the college football rules in the United States really started to be solidified. And in Canada, while the Ontario Rugby Football Union adopted the Burnside rules in 1903, the other Canadian rugby football organizations stayed away. The Canadian game adopted the 3-down rule first in 1906. By that time, it took 10 yards to get a first down. Of course, this was the same year that college football in the United States went to 10 yards for a first down. And even then, things as basic as the number of players per side varied from one province to another in the Canadian game. And in fact, things as basic as the way the clock worked differed from place to place. It wasn't until 1921 that all the rugby football unions in Canada decided to finally go along with the Burnside rules. And those rules were different than what we're used to in the United States. The field was still 110 yards long, which was the original length of the field under Walter Camp back in the 1880s. They kept the 3-down system instead of adding in a 4th down. And the Canadian game allowed 12 men per side, something that also continues to this day. Now, if you watch any Canadian football game, you'll notice immediately that there's another major difference. More than one offensive back can move before the snap. This creates a pretty jarring visual image to those of us used to the United States game. I swear that these guys cross the line of scrimmage before the ball is snapped. Now, the important thing to understand is that the Canadian game has been separate from the United States game for well over a century now. It's adopted its own certain unique characteristics, things that really make the game interesting. And it would be awful if those unique differences went away for commercial reasons, especially since the Canadian game has successfully fended off the United States challenge for so long. In fact, if you go back to say 1954, you'll notice that the Canadian professional game was more popular in the United States than the NFL. 1954, of course, was the year that NBC decided to broadcast Canadian football games live on Saturdays. That's back when the NFL was on the old Dumont network, a network that was notorious for not offering enough games. In fact, the sports were so different in those days that the Canadian game still had the old 5 points for a touchdown rule, and the Canadian Football League itself had not even been formed yet. And yet it's clear that the Canadian game was quite popular in the United States. But the NFL wised up and the United States game wound up prevailing in the United States. Meanwhile, the Canadian game only occasionally popped up on the United States radar. Sure, there were broadcasts of CFL games on United States television during the 1982 NFL strike, but unfortunately, the games NBC chose to air were blowouts and got horribly low ratings. For example, NBC was there to broadcast this Calgary at Saskatchewan blowout on October 3, 1982. The game was so bad that NBC ended the broadcast before the game ended, just like that famous Heidi game, but nobody in 1982 seems to have noticed or cared. Now, the next event that caused Canadian football to emerge on the United States sporting scene was a financial catastrophe for the Canadian Football League, oddly enough. The Carling O'Keefe Brewery decided to give the CFL a considerably lower amount to sponsor CFL broadcasts in 1987 that led the league toward a financial crisis. Now, this crisis affected every single team in the CFL and laid the theoretical groundwork for an attempt to expand the Canadian game into the United States. In hindsight, this was a really crazy idea. However, the truth is that the Canadian market was limited and the CFL really needed to figure out a way to get additional eyeballs and additional advertiser dollars. Plus, what we tend to forget is that the CFL at that time did have a few tricks up its sleeve. So the most famous trick that they had was this man, Boston College hero Doug Flutie. By 1991, in only his second season in the league, the famous Hail Mary quarterback had established himself as the greatest quarterback in CFL history. 1991 was also the season that the Toronto Argonauts shocked everybody by drafting Rocket Ismail, the Notre Dame star. Now, the story behind that signing goes to LA Kings owner Bruce McNall and hockey legend Wayne Gretzky, who had teamed up to purchase the Argonauts. Of course, that's the same pair of rich celebrities who once famously owned the so-called McNall-Gretzky T206 Honus Wagner baseball card. The pair bought the card for $451,000 only a month before they decided to draft Ismail. And Ismail had a contract giving him over $4 million per season for 4 years. That's more per season than the CFL's entire team salary cap. Unfortunately for the big spenders, Ismail's career didn't quite pan out. They probably should have bought more baseball cards instead. However, the successful draft of the Rocket to the CFL set the stage for the CFL to really splash the cash on expanding its teams to the South. For the 1993 season, the CFL voted to expand to add 2 American teams. One was the Sacramento Gold Miners, and the other was supposed to be the San Antonio Texans, though that team ran out of money before playing even a single game. In a confusing flurry of action, the league expanded to several cities in 1994, though the only city that had any real promise was Baltimore. The Baltimore Stallions took the place of the old Baltimore Colts and were a big hit in a city that had gone without top-level football for a decade. As luck would have it, Baltimore wound up going to the Grey Cup in 1994, its first season in the league. Baltimore almost won that game, in fact. The next season, in 1995, Baltimore not only returned to the Cup, but wound up winning the whole thing. That's pretty impressive, right? I mean, they expanded the CFL to the country down south, and the best team from the United States wound up going to the championship in both of its first 2 seasons. Unfortunately, though, the success would not last. Just 2 weeks before that 1995 Grey Cup, the announcement came that the Cleveland Browns were moving to Baltimore. Everybody forgot about the CFL team right away and welcomed the return of the NFL. On February 3, 1996, the Stallions moved to Montreal, ending the CFL experiment in the United States. And the league really hasn't tried to come back since. Now, what you'll notice here is just how much the tables have turned. The Canadian professional game was stronger than the NFL in 1954. 40 years later, the NFL was so strong that the Canadian game was swept aside without a moment's hesitation, and that brings us to the present day. There's still a lot of charm left in the CFL. However, from the numbers that I've seen, the ratings have been declining rapidly. Part of the problem is probably that the most successful teams at the moment, Saskatchewan, Hamilton, and Calgary, are all from small markets. The team in Vancouver has a winning record at the moment but has struggled, and the Toronto Argonauts aren't playing well at all. Well, of course, that's going to happen in sports, and of course, television ratings for traditional programs have been down everywhere anyway. This might not be the CFL's fault, but the question you have to ask yourself is changing the length of the football field really going to help solve any of this? And then there's the ever-present possibility that the NFL might move a team to Toronto, something that really must strike fear in the heart of CFL owners. This has been a topic of conversation for decades, of course, so much so that there's an extensive Wikipedia page devoted to it. Opponents of the deal point to the fact that the Rogers Center didn't exactly draw great crowds in the past when Buffalo Bills home games were occasionally played up there. But that doesn't mean that Toronto wouldn't support its own NFL team. So I lived in Ontario about a decade ago. What I discovered when I was there was that there were a lot of football fans, though they tended to like NFL teams, and they liked them for reasons other than geography. In other words, there really is not a huge Buffalo Bills fan base up in Ontario, but I think that there absolutely would be a fan base for a Canadian team. But of course, a move like that would spell disaster for the Canadian game. The CFL has already shown that it simply cannot compete directly against the NFL. In fact, if you look at the CFL schedule, you will notice that most games are played on Saturdays and that the league avoids Sunday for the most part, with the exception, of course, of the Grey Cup. Even though the NFL isn't in town, the CFL still has to always keep the NFL in mind. This is simply because a lot of the would-be CFL fans would likely watch NFL games instead if it had to choose between the two. And to be blunt, I really don't see how changing the CFL's rules to look more like the NFL solves this problem. You see, the problem with the CFL isn't offense. No, it's the back office and the ridiculous ways the league has spent money over the years. Now, in my opinion, the sport itself is just fine. In fact, I think it could compete with the United States game if the Canadian game were just a little bit more developed. But if you change the rules to look like the United States game, the CFL will look like the NFL's minor league. And you know, if that were to happen, I really don't think the Canadian Football League would survive. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments.